Guam has always been on the front lines of global power's ambitions. It's an island with a rich military history. Today, it continues to serve as a strategic military outpost for the United States. However, what many do not know is the island's intense past, one shaped by colonialism, military rule, and a long fight for political autonomy. Despite its pivotal role, Guam remains relatively unknown internationally, and its struggles for self-determination often go unnoticed. Let us look back on its past under military rule, the continuous fight for civil rights, and the eventual establishment of a more democratic government. Before the United States arrived on Guam, the island was under Spanish colonial rule for over 300 years. During this period, Guam's role was primarily as a supply stop for the Spanish galleons, and its indigenous Chamorro people lived under the strict policies of the Spanish crown. Although Spain's governance was far from benevolent, it was a stable form of colonial rule compared to the disruptions that came after the Spanish-American War. In 1898, the US took control of Guam and marked the end of Spanish rule. However, the change in governance did not bring immediate relief for the Chamorros, who now faced a new colonial regime, this time under the US military. Following the Spanish-American War, Guam officially became a US territory, and the island was placed under military control. The first US Navy governor, Richard Leary, took office in 1899, marking the beginning of a new chapter in the island's history. Leary's administration was the first to implement US military rule, and his time in office would shape much of Guam's early relationship with the United States. The Chamorros found themselves under more restrictive governance than they had been under the Spanish, including the required ownership of certain property, literacy, and restricted religious gathering. Quote, "For the protection of government interests and as a safeguard for the residents of Guam against the machinations, devices, and schemes of speculators and adventurers, it is hereby ordered that all persons who claim ownership of land in this island or its dependencies are prohibited from selling or transferring any portion of such property without first obtaining the consent of the government. Violation of this order may be punished by fine or imprisonment, or both." Later, according to his aide, William Safford, Leary often left things to others, such as the time he had Safford give a divorce in his name after a complaint with the law. In 1901, 32 prominent Chamorro leaders submitted a petition calling for a permanent civilian government to replace the military regime. They argued that the Navy's governance was unjust and overly restrictive, with the Chamorro people being treated as subjects under military law rather than citizens with rights. Although he acknowledged the islanders' concerns, he defended military rule as essential for maintaining order and stability. This petition, however, marked the beginning of a long struggle for political autonomy and self-governance. The fight for a permanent government did not fade. In the following decades, petitions from the Chamorro people continued to call for greater civil rights and an end to the authoritarian grip of military governance. In the early 20th century, Governor William John Maxwell took note of how unfunctional the system in place was. He took significant steps in addressing the island's needs by establishing the Bank of Guam and tidying up the government and its associated systems. However, despite these improvements, the structure remained largely unresponsive to the people's calls for greater political rights. In the 1930s, Governor Willis Bradley proposed a Bill of Rights for Guam based on the U.S. Constitution's first 10 amendments. While his efforts were blocked by the Navy, the idea of legal protection for Chamorro rights gained momentum. Though the people's petitions were repeatedly ignored, the demands for freedom and self-governance only grew stronger. Guam's population faced numerous challenges, but their resilience in pushing for civil rights would eventually lead to change. The period of US military rule took a dark turn during World War II. In 1941, just a day after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces invaded Guam. Governor George McMillan, the final US Navy governor, oversaw the island's surrender on December 10th. The Chamorro people suffered greatly under Japanese occupation, enduring forced labor, internment, and horrific violence. Children would hide under corpses, and the rights of the people hit an all-time low. The island's infrastructure was decimated, and many Chamorros lost their lives in the turmoil. After the war ended, the people of Guam once again found themselves under American military control, with few changes to their status or rights. The legacy of their suffering during the war highlighted the urgency for political change and self-determination, setting the stage for future social and political reform, with the war in the Pacific still being one of the most prominent topics for people on the island today. In 1950, President Harry Truman signed the Guam Organic Act, providing the island with a new framework for governance. This act laid the foundation for Guam's modern political system by granting it a civilian government, although it was still ultimately subject to U.S. control. Compared to the naval government, the Organic Act allowed for greater local participation, including the election of a governor and the establishment of a legislative body. Yet many of the limitations from the military period remained in place. The transition was seen as a positive step, but there were still lingering issues with Guam's political status and autonomy. Congressman Robert Underwood, in a 1998 address, noted how the people of Guam longed for greater political development, reflecting the ongoing struggle for self-determination. The Organic Act marked the beginning of a new era for Guam, one in which the island would continue to fight for greater rights and political recognition, building on the foundation laid by earlier struggles. As Guam continues its journey toward full self-determination, we are reminded of its complex history and the enduring spirit of its people, whose fight for a more democratic and autonomous future remains as relevant today as it was decades ago.